Welcome to the Storm Council Hurricane History Series. This is Volume 1, Part 1 of the Hurricane History Series covering the Galveston Hurricane of 1900. This episode is entitled The Certainty of Isaac Cline, How Partial Knowledge and Professional Confidence Killed 8,000 People. For more information about the Storm Council, visit stormcouncil.com and subscribe to the YouTube channel at @storm_council. Isaac Cline was not a fool. This is the fact that makes the Galveston disaster so instructive and so difficult to dismiss. He was trained, experienced, and had studied tropical cyclones for years. He could read a barometer with the precision his profession demanded, and he understood in the general terms available to meteorology in 1900 how Atlantic hurricanes behaved. He was, by the standards of his era, exactly the kind of person you would want standing between your city and a storm. And on September 8, 1900, that competence killed 8,000 people. To understand Cline's failure, you must first understand the institution he served. The United States Weather Bureau was barely 2 decades old when the hurricane arrived. The Bureau had been transferred from the Army Signal Corps to the Department of Agriculture in 1891, a bureaucratic reshuffling that signaled the government's growing belief that weather prediction had civilian applications worth investing in. But investment and capability are not the same thing. The Bureau's observational network was primitive by any modern standard. There were no weather satellites, no radar, and no aircraft reconnaissance. Forecasters relied on ship reports, often days old by the time they arrived by telegraph, and a scattering of land-based stations that measured temperature, pressure, wind speed, and rainfall. The stations communicated by telegraph, which meant that data flowed only as fast as the wires could carry it, and only to the places the wires reached. Large portions of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean were effectively invisible. A hurricane could form, intensify, and approach the coast with almost no advance warning. Cline worked within this system as faithfully as any man could. He took his readings and he filed his reports. He watched the sky with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years on the Gulf Coast. But the system itself had a structural weakness that no individual observer could compensate for. It could tell you what was happening at the station where you stood. It could not reliably tell you what was happening 200 miles away over open water. On the morning of September 8th, Cline noted the barometric pressure was falling. By afternoon it had reached 29.42 inches, low enough to indicate the proximity of a significant weather system. By evening it would plunge to 28.97, a reading that Cline himself acknowledged in his notes demanded attention. The Gulf was showing an unusual swell, the tide was higher than it should have been, and clouds moved in unfamiliar patterns. These were data points. Each one, taken individually, told Cline something was approaching. Taken together, they should have told him something catastrophic was approaching. But Cline's interpretation of the data was filtered through a framework of assumptions that the data itself could not correct. His central assumption was geographic. He believed the hurricane's center lay to the west, tracking over Louisiana. If this was true, Galveston would experience the storm's weaker eastern quadrant. High winds and rain, certainly, but not the catastrophic storm surge that accompanied a direct hit. This assumption was based on wind direction observations and the general movement patterns of Gulf hurricanes as Cline understood them. It was a reasonable inference from the data he had. And it was also wrong. In the Storm Council series, the Council Elder makes it clear what's at the root of nearly every institutional failing in U.S. storm history. There is a difference between confidence born of knowledge and confidence born of the absence of contradicting data. In the case of Isaac Cline, he didn't have evidence that the hurricane was tracking toward Louisiana. He had an absence of evidence it was tracking directly toward Galveston. In a system with comprehensive observation, satellites, buoys, reconnaissance aircraft, this distinction would have been obvious. But at the Weather Bureau of 1900, it was invisible. This is the epistemological trap that catches competent people inside limited systems. This is where discernment cracks and human lives are lost. 1. You know enough to form a hypothesis. 2. You lack the data to test it rigorously. And 3. Because you know enough to form the hypothesis in the first place, you trust it more than you should. The partial knowledge becomes the whole picture. The blank spaces on the map become confirmation rather than warning. Cline's error wasn't mathematical, and it wasn't a miscalculation of pressure gradients or a misreading of his instruments. It was a failure to recognize that his instruments couldn't tell him what he needed to know. The barometer could tell him the pressure was falling, but it couldn't tell him where the center of the hurricane was. The wind vane could tell him the current direction, but it couldn't tell him the storm's track. Every instrument on his desk was performing exactly as designed. The system simply was not designed to answer the question upon which 38,000 lives depended. Cline didn't issue an evacuation order on Friday or Saturday, the day the hurricane landed in Galveston. He issued what amounted to a storm warning, an advisory that a tropical disturbance was in the area and that residents should take ordinary precautions. For a barrier island 8 feet above sea level, with no seawall, facing a hurricane with 140+ mile per hour sustained winds, ordinary precautions were not precautions at all. Years later, Cline would claim in his memoirs he had personally driven a horse-drawn cart along the beach that morning, warning residents to move to higher ground. This claim has been disputed by historians and contradicted by contemporary accounts. What is not disputed is the Weather Bureau's official communications that day did not convey the gravity of what was approaching. The institutional voice of American meteorology, speaking through its representative in Galveston, told the city that the situation was concerning but manageable. By nightfall, the situation was neither. Isaac Cline's failure in Galveston established a pattern the Storm Council would observe repeated across the next century of American hurricanes. It's not a pattern of incompetence. It's something far more dangerous. A pattern of competence operating at the boundary of its own knowledge and mistaking that boundary for solid ground. In Miami, in 1926, city leaders who understood real estate would dismiss meteorological warnings because the warnings threatened the real estate development boom. In Okeechobee, in 1928, a warning system designed for the coast would fail to reach migrant workers 60 miles inland, not because the technology didn't exist, but because no one had thought to extend it to people who were invisible to the system. On Labor Day in 1935, the Veterans Administration would delay an evacuation train because the bureaucracy moved at the speed VA paperwork moves through its bureaucracy, while the hurricane moved at the speed of wind. In each case, the failure wasn't ignorance. It was the gap between what the institution knew and what it acted upon. Cline knew hurricanes were dangerous. He didn't know this hurricane was aimed at his city. The gap between those two pieces of knowledge contained 8,000 deaths. The Storm Council. Elder comes to this conclusion repeatedly throughout the history of U.S. hurricanes. False confidence from partial knowledge is more dangerous than honest ignorance. The person who knows nothing may ask for help. The person who knows something, enough to be credible, enough to hold authority, may not recognize the moment when their knowledge fails them. And in that moment, everyone who depends on their judgment pays the price. Had Cline treated the falling barometer as the operative danger? Had he said, in effect, "I do not know where this hurricane is going, and therefore we must assume the worst," the evacuation could have begun 12 hours before the surge arrived. 12 hours was enough time. The bridges to the mainland were still passable, and the trains were still running. But when you're unshakably certain, you don't have questions, only clarity. And by the time the questions answered themselves, the surge water was already in the streets. The Storm Council is a historical narrative series examining the storms that reshaped cities, infrastructure, and human systems. Across centuries of American history, hurricanes have repeatedly exposed the hidden weaknesses of settlement patterns, engineering assumptions, economic systems, and governance structures. The Storm Council studies these moments of failure and adaptation. Through books, essays, archive entries, and analytical commentary, the series reconstructs the storms that altered the trajectory of coastal development and disaster policy. In the Storm Council framework, storms are not simply weather events. They are forces acting upon human systems. Each storm tests the structure societies build, revealing which assumptions hold and which collapse under pressure. The Storm Council records these moments in the record, a growing historical archive examining how storms reshape the relationship between human ambition and natural forces. Robert Pudlock is the author of the Storm Council. His work explores how storms expose structural weaknesses in human systems, revealing the consequences of engineering decisions, settlement patterns, economic incentives, and governance choices. Through the Storm Council series, Robert reconstructs the historical record of storms not simply as natural disasters, but as moments when physical reality tests the assumptions of human systems. The Storm Council project includes books, archive essays, historical analyses, and institutional commentary designed to illuminate the long arc of storm-driven change across American history. This is Volume 1, Part 1, covering the Galveston Hurricane of 1900, the certainty of Isaac Klein, and how partial knowledge and professional confidence killed over 8,000 people. For more information about the Storm Council, visit stormcouncil.com and subscribe to the YouTube channel at @storm_council. You can purchase the Storm Council book series at your favorite bookstores, including Amazon.